Okie. I first became acquainted with Mary Neal, Dr. Mary Neal, upon seeing the Dr. Oz show last September. And I was immediately struck with what an incredible representative she is for the other side, because she's not only a doctor, which gives her enormous credibility, but she herself is also a very, very intelligent person with clear and concise ability to see kind of what's going on and to express herself. And I thought, wow, this is really, really, really good. And so I called her office number and managed to connect with her. She called me back, and the rest is history. And she came in night before last, and we've had a wonderful time getting to know each other. I know you're absolutely going to enjoy her story and her presentation very, very much. Please give a warm welcome for Dr. Mary Neal.
Well, I hate standing behind a lectern, but I typically talk with my hands, so I don't think I can do very well with that mic. And I have to tell you that I'm envious of all of you because you're actually here voluntarily. And I would say that I'm not particularly here voluntarily. This is not really my cup of tea. I certainly can give medical lectures, but I'm not particularly an outgoing verbal person. So we'll wing it. And I will also ask for your forgiveness. I have given a number of radio interviews in the last couple of months, and radio interviews and even the Dr. Oz show, I mean, all of the interview formats are very, very compressed. So I've developed a great skill at telling my story in 3 sentences or less. So the idea of seeing that clock saying 3:35 and knowing that this is supposed to go until 5 makes me a little uncomfortable.
No, you can tell us everything.
Right, so I have no idea actually what's going to come out of my mouth, but I will tell you that this is not a monologue. I mean, I'm standing up here, so I'm beginning to feel like I'm speaking at you, but I really feel like this is a dialogue, and I want you to feel perfectly free to interrupt me if a question or a thought pops in your mind or I'm skipping over something. So please don't hesitate. And I'll just give you a little background about who I am, or at least what the world sees me as. And I am an orthopedic surgeon. I'm specifically a spine surgeon. I grew up in Michigan, and so it's really funny going around in the room and listening to people tell their names. My name is Mary. From the time I left Michigan until today, I don't think I've actually met another Mary. And in this room, there are more Marys. It's incredible. Anyway, I grew up in Michigan and left Michigan after high school, went to college in Kentucky, and from Kentucky went to medical school at UCLA. And from UCLA, I stayed there to do general surgery training, then left UCLA and went over to University of Southern California for my orthopedic training. And after that, I spent 6 months in Sweden and Switzerland doing spine specialty training. Came back to the United States for a 1-year spine fellowship in Los Angeles. And once I completed that, I joined the USC faculty as the director of spine surgery. And I ran the spine service for 5 or 6 years, and finally was beginning to learn how to integrate my life. Left the university, which really freed us up to do whatever we wanted. My husband is also an orthopedic surgeon, grew up in California. His family was still there, which is really why we stayed there. And of course, his brothers had moved off and his parents were going to retire. So when I left the university, we sort of looked at each other, and at that time we had, at that time we had 3 kids, and I was pregnant with the 4th. And we said, well, we didn't even want to be in California. And so we looked around at different places, and we ended up in Jackson Hole. And I'll tell you, the way we ended up in Jackson Hole is a great example among many, many examples of how everything happens in the plan. And there really is no such thing as coincidence. We discussed where I would like to live and where my husband would like to live, and there was exactly one town that overlapped, and that was Jackson Hole. And Jackson Hole is only a town of about 20,000 people. There are several million that come in to go to Yellowstone, but it's the kind of place that you can't really just show up. And so we said, well, okay, we were not unhappy in California. We had a great life. And we said, fine, we'll stay. And a couple of weeks later, my husband was absent-mindedly flipping through one of the journals and saw this tiny little ad for a spine surgeon in Jackson Hole. Looked at it long and hard, because I would say that he is not particularly spiritual, and at the time he really wasn't. But he knew, when he looked at that, he knew that if he gave that to me, it would change our lives. And ultimately he did give it to me, and 3 months later we were moving to Jackson Hole. So anyway, so we moved to Jackson Hole, and I've been in practice since that time. If you talk about what I was like before my boating accident, I was raised in a Presbyterian church. My grandfather, who I had never met, and his father were Presbyterian ministers. But in our family, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, spirituality was a Sunday morning thing. We did go to church, and that was it. You know, then we'd walk outside and resume our life. And I think that was pretty typical of that era. And I was never asked or expected to incorporate any of the church's teachings into my life, other than being a good person. And it certainly wasn't something that you were expected to think about, talk about, and really focus on. It was pretty typical. And I oftentimes say that my life has really been quite ordinary. And then I went to college, and I mean, if you're going to go to medical school, college is not really a fun thing. I swam competitively in college, and between swimming and studies, that was it. I did not have time for spiritual thoughts, for sure. And in medical school, I would say the same. I was very busy. I did, during those years, have some intense spiritual experiences, after which I said, oh, well, okay, now back to life. Because as most, if not all of you know, life can be pretty hectic, and the details of every day can certainly squeeze out any time to think about your spiritual life. And so then I finished medical school, and by then we already had one child, and then I did my fellowships, and the kids kept coming, and you would think we would know how they come, but regardless, we kept having more children. And at that point, again, I think I'm pretty typical. I think I'm pretty ordinary. At that point, I looked at my children, and I knew that I wanted them to believe in God. I'm not sure that I thought any more about it other than that. And we did find a local church whose tenets we could ascribe to, and we did take our kids to church. And I would say that I tried to make it more integrated than it had been when I grew up. I did try to bring spirituality into our home. I won't say that I did a very good job of it, but at least I did do things like at Christmas, we actually really did celebrate a birthday. We didn't celebrate it in the way that the stores would want us to. But I certainly didn't do a good job of it. And then we moved, and that really is sort of where I was spiritually. I was a believer, and I kept having experiences and recommitting myself to make spirituality a bigger part of my life. And then I would get over it and go back to my life. And I think that's really, really common until we get to be a little older and we actually start thinking about our mortality, at which time we start to think a little bit more about our spirituality. And that's sort of my background. My husband and I are very active, very athletic. We live in Jackson Hole, Wyoming because we can walk out our door and ski or boat or bike or do about 15 different activities that we do pretty regularly. And we do kayak quite a bit. And the kayaking we do, and many people who don't kayak wonder why someone would be crazy enough to do it. But like any sport or any activity, it's really a controlled risk. You develop the skill sets, and as your skill develops, you start to boat more and more difficult things. And so as I go on to talk about my boating accident, I want you to recognize that we actually had the skill sets to be in big white water. And before we moved to Wyoming, my husband and my oldest son had gone to a particular kayak camp with some people who own a raft and kayak company in Idaho. And they had befriended them, and over the years then we became very good friends with them. We took our kids to kayak, we kayaked with them. And they, during the winter months, live in Chile, in South America. And they lived there because they're at the time, the two oldest boys were international level whitewater kayakers, and to go to South America in the winter allowed them to train during the winter. And any of you that have been involved with international level sports know that it's a year-round thing. You can't just do a sport in season. So they were there every winter, and they began running trips, or at least having a few clients come down to help cover the costs of living there for 4 or 5 months. And we talked about it, and then I thought, well, that will be a great gift for my husband's birthday, which is in the winter time. And so we moved to Wyoming in March of 1999, and in January, 1998, and in January 1999, my youngest son was 7 months old, and we thought that, okay, we can leave the country. We had the luxury of having a live-in nanny, live-in babysitter, in whom we had great confidence, so we thought, great. So we left Jackson and went to Chile. And we spent the week paddling with these friends of ours and working on all sorts of rivers and having a great time. And if you haven't been to Chile, I would highly recommend it. It's a beautiful country and beautiful people. And then what was going to be our last day of paddling, we were going to paddle a river that's quite inaccessible, and it's a river that has waterfall after waterfall after waterfall. And I'm only going to say this because there are a number of people who have sort of stopped listening at this point because they assume that I'm crazy, and if I went over waterfalls, I should have died anyway. But this is where I really want to emphasize that, yeah, you go over a waterfall, but it's because you have the skill set to do it. So I do want to emphasize that this was not out of the realm of, quote, normal activity for a kayaker. My husband woke up that morning with back pain, which he never had before that day, and he's never had since. But he woke up with terrible back pain, and because this river is so inaccessible, decided not to paddle that day. And so he drove the shuttle. And what that means is he drove these friends of ours who run the kayak company, and me and a couple of other Americans to the place on the river that we were putting in. And this is in an area of Chile, and I don't know how many of you have been to Chile, but this is now a number of years ago, in southern Chile, which is very remote. I mean, there just isn't development, there aren't population bases, and there are no services. And this particular river was not only incredibly inaccessible, but the entire section we were boating is basically a gorge, a very steep gorge, very steep hillsides that were absolutely thickly covered in bamboo forests. Very, I mean, once you're on the river, you're going to go down the whole river. And so he dropped us off and drove off, and he was going to find a sunny place to just breathe and then pick us up at the end of the run. And I, at the time, would like to have thought that I was reasonably in touch with my feelings, and but I'm really I'm a skeptic at heart, and I'm a cynic, and I'm not really that in tune with the touchy-feely part of life, or at that time I wasn't. But we put on the river, and there was one particular woman that really made me very uncomfortable. At the time, I thought maybe it was because I didn't think she had the skills really to be on that river, and I hadn't paddled with her before, and she was making me very uncomfortable. So we started down the river, and I spent my energy either trying to stay well ahead of her, well behind her, somehow just stay away from her, which wasn't that easy to do. There aren't very many of us. So then we came to one of the first waterfalls, or one of the first drops, and pulled into an eddy on the side of the river and talked about how we were going to run this particular drop, this particular waterfall. And there were basically two drops, and this was reasonably high water level. There was a tremendous amount of volume. And the first person took off, and they went over one drop, and they didn't particularly hit it right, so their boat was wedged sideways in the drop between a couple of rocks. And okay, they pulled. If you think about kayaking, and I'm sorry, I don't know who has been kayaking and who hasn't, but you have the plastic boat, you have the cockpit, and then there's a neoprene spray skirt that covers the cockpit and comes up your waist so that it keeps the water out. And you want it on tightly, especially when you're running big water, because you don't want the force of the water to pop the skirt, because then you're definitely out of luck. So they're on fairly tightly, but she was able to pull this grab loop and get out of the boat and go. But I was right behind her. The boat was across the channel, so I said, well, okay, go down a different channel. The woman who I had been so painstakingly avoiding bumped by me and went down this other channel. And so I tried to backpedal, but there weren't any eddies, so I was reasonably committed. But she went over and I didn't see anything about it, but the drops are big enough that it's not like most rapids where you can sort of see what's happening at the bottom. This is, a pretty notable drop. So I looked at the one drop, boat was across it, looked at the other drop. I knew that it wasn't exactly the drop we had planned to go over, but what were my options? So I decided to go over that drop, and as soon as I crested the top of it, I thought, oh, this was not a good idea. That's not really what I said. I said something that I won't say. But I knew it was not going to be good because there was not a clean exit. There were sort of rock jumble at the bottom, and I actually didn't know it, and no one realized it at the time, and really for quite a while. But the person who had bumped ahead of me actually had gone through this drop, and again, because it wasn't a clean exit, her boat had been pinned. She was able to pull her spray skirt out and swim. When I went over the drop, I saw the jumble of rocks, and I knew things were going to be not so good. I actually didn't see her boat. Her boat was completely submerged. When I went down then, as it is, my boat actually went under hers, and there I was. So at that point I was pinned, and I was upright in my boat, but underwater, because it's not waterfall like you're sitting there and your head's out of the water. I was underwater, and I thought, not good, okay? And as a kayaker, there are things you do, because of course, there are many situations where you can be pinned, and there are things you kind of play over in your mind. I mean, there are techniques to try to get out of the boat, to do all kinds of different things. And I've been kayaking for 20 years prior to this. And I tried everything. And nothing worked. And I was in the boat then, upright, facing, in theory, downriver with the current. So there was a tremendous amount of volume and force. So I was bent over the deck of my boat with my arms, this way, and sort of like a little rag doll. And I couldn't even, the force was so great, and I was in good shape then. Maybe not so good now, but I couldn't even pull my arm back far enough to even grab the loop on the spray skirt, let alone pull it off. There was nothing. I realized very quickly that nothing I was going to do was going to make a difference. And I sort of thought for a moment, and I said, well, I really asked that God's will be done. I did believe in God. God had showed himself to me at other points in my life. And I really did just ask for God's will be done. I didn't say, hey, come and save me, buddy. I need out. And at that moment in time, everything changed. I felt absolute bliss. I was physically being held and comforted and stroked and reassured, and it was, it was fantastic, actually. And I knew I was drowning. I knew that I wasn't breathing, which was remarkable because as I was growing up, and it's not that my friends and I talked about death all the time, but intermittently when you're a kid, at least within my childhood, intermittently people would say, oh, well, I don't care if I die as long as I don't, whatever, get hit by a car, something. Well, mine was always, as long as I don't drown, I'm good. I was always terrified of drowning, even though I'm a water person. I love the water, I swam competitively. I really didn't want to drown. So here I was in this position drowning, and I was thinking, oh, this is pretty good. But it was really such a physical and absolute experience. And I will say that one of the gals who was downstream, who wouldn't have claimed to be an atheist, but certainly would have claimed to be an agnostic, said that she saw God. This was before they even knew I was missing, but she said that there was just this absolute brilliance and glow, and she said she was downstream going, oh my gosh, well that's weird. But from my perspective, it was very comforting. I was reassured that everything was okay and I would be fine and everyone would be fine. And of course, I had a husband that I loved then and I still love. And I love my children as much as I could ever imagine loving something on earth. And my youngest son, as I said, was only a baby. I did think about them, and I was reassured that whether I lived or whether I died, they would be fine. I would be fine. Now, that word fine is always interesting because it wasn't, oh, they'll be happy, and oh, they'll be all sorts of other things. It was, they'll be fine. And with that reassurance, I was able to be really very calm. I had no pain. I was fine. And of course, I thought about my life. I thought about my entire life, and the highs and the lows, and things I would change, things I wouldn't change. And I thought about everything again and again and again. And I was again reassured that even in going through my life and thinking about the times that I perhaps wasn't so happy about either what I had done or how I had behaved, I was again reassured again and again and again that it's okay. And this went on long enough that finally I was so bored. I was going like, oh, come on. I've never been known to be a particularly patient person. And I couldn't believe that I was asking God to just hurry up. Like, okay, you told me I'm fine, my family will be fine, everyone will be fine, let's get on with it. Because I just wanted to know where we were going with this. So when the time came, I felt the boat shift a little bit and could feel my body being sucked out of the boat. And so again, if I'm sitting like this, my body was then being sucked out by the current over the deck of the boat. And so it was very slow. And so ever so slowly I was coming around the deck of the boat, which is fine with regard to my hips. When it came to my knees, they don't really bend that way. And so I could feel bones breaking, and I could feel some of the ligaments tearing. And remember, I'm an orthopedic surgeon. So I was thinking, well, and I will say even before that, I mean, I'm an analytical person and very much of a concrete thinker. I'm not fanciful or creative. And even before that, I kept going through this sort of life review and being reassured. But then this other part of me kept saying, really? is this really happening? And sort of doing these little self-assessment exams all along. And then as I was being sucked out of my boat, I kept thinking about, wow, that sounds like my plateau. And gee, I think that was probably my ACL. And I, at one point, asked myself if I was screaming, but I just didn't know it because I had no pain. I felt great. I felt pure and absolute bliss. And yes.
Were you breathing during
No.
all this, or were you dead?
Well, I didn't have any oxygen.
Right, so this is how many minutes?
Well, I'll come back to that,
Okay.
if you don't mind. So I kept asking myself if I was screaming, if I actually asked if I was breathing, and the answer to all these things were, well, no, but I feel really good. And as my body was being sucked out of the boat, I could feel my spirit separating from my body, almost like two pieces of tape being pulled apart. And it was going, and then finally my body was sucked free of the boat and my spirit was free. And at that point, well, actually, I'll get to that in just a minute. So going back to your question. So from the perspective of the people I was kayaking with, there were a couple people still above the drop, there were a couple people below, and it took them, they were guessing anywhere from 3 to 5 minutes to sort of make sense of what was going on. Because this first boater had swum, they could see her boat, and then the second boater, she wasn't actually the second person to go, but this boater had swum and was sitting on a rock in the middle of the river, but they couldn't find her boat. And then they didn't, downriver, neither I nor my boat were there. But they sort of kept waiting because you couldn't, from downriver, you couldn't see the top of the rapid either. So those guys estimate that 3 to 5 minutes or so before they realized that no, actually, Mary's gone and her boat's gone. So it took them a while to try to figure that one out. And then finally, one of them caught a glimpse of red, which actually was part of the boat, the first boater in the Strops boat. But they thought it was mine, and they said, oh, okay. And then they came to try to rescue me. And these people are professional boaters. They teach water rescue. This is what they do. And they set up all their usual ways of trying to rescue someone. And between the shore and the drop, there wasn't any way to get to me. They could get almost there, but not quite close enough to make a difference. And so they would keep trying to do all sorts of different things, and nothing worked, and they just kept getting flushed through this waterfall, and then they'd have to come back up. And these are friends of ours. It's not just that I was a client, and their panic level was starting to increase, even though they recovered many people. And from their perspective, it then turned into really body recovery, not rescue. But even at that, they were unwilling to leave my body there, knowing that my husband would be expecting at least a body. And so they kept at it, and finally the dad said, boys, because the three guys, it's the dad and the two oldest sons, but these are young men. The one son was 18, and the other was 20, and were young men. And they basically stopped for a minute and they said, no, there's no way we're going to be able to do this. This has to be supernatural. And they took a moment and prayed. And after that moment, they then said, well, okay, and a rock between where they were standing and the drop was there, dry. And by stepping onto that rock, they were then able to reach my boat. And then the 18-year-old thought he saw a flash of something. And the force of the water had ripped off my helmet and life jacket, and then it sucked my body out. And the flash of something, I don't know, maybe it was my life jacket going or something. So he dove in downriver to get that because he thought, well, you know, maybe Bill will want her life jacket for some reason. So he did grab this life jacket when it surfaced. And as he was there sort of deciding what to do, he felt something bump into him, and he reached down and he felt my wrist and grabbed my wrist and dragged my body to the riverbank, and then they started CPR. So that's a very long-winded way to get to the answer to your question, which is from the time they realized that I and my boat were missing. I mean, because they're used to rescue and being able to say, look, like, we're not going to do this anymore. They're used to starting their watches. And so from the time they actually realized it, which was 3 to 5 minutes, to the time he dragged me to the riverbank was 12 minutes. And then from dragging me to the riverbank to resuscitation, 5 minutes, something like that. So all said, from their estimates, it's sort of 20 to 25 minutes without oxygen, which is a long time. So that was a very long way to get to your answer, but it gives you their perspective on that. And they started resuscitation, and let's see, one gal sort of freaked out, and she took off running through the bamboo. And they just sort of said, well, okay, I mean, we can't go after her. And she ended up running to where my husband was parked. And my husband had been there reading in the sun, having a wonderful time. And about the time that I was drowning, he was overcome with this feeling that everything was fine. And again, I use that word fine. That is the word that kept coming up, everything was fine. And then she came, and when she was running up, he sort of knew what the problem was. So then they got in the truck and drove. Another gal was there. I mean, this is sort of the weird part. I mean, some people are a little odd. One guy wanted to videotape the whole thing. And then there was another woman who kept screaming at them not to resuscitate her, meaning me, because she'll just be a vegetable, and I don't know, it was all kind of crazy. But from their perspective, they started resuscitating me, and the 18-year-old, and then the other boy is only 16. The 18-year-old was never able to divorce himself from me as an individual, which I don't know how many of you do any sort of emergency or have any sort of emergency training, but one of the absolute hallmarks is that you divorce yourself from the individual. You march through the protocol and you keep going through it until it either works or you call the code. You don't think about the fact that this is whomever. And they were never able to do that. The 18-year-old boy kept looking around saying, Mary, I know you're still here. I know you're here. Please come back and take a breath. And what they said is they would do that, he would yell that, and then I would take a breath, and then that would be that. And he would start, you know, calling this out again, and then I would come back and take a breath. And that cycle went on for about 5 more minutes until I started breathing, and that was the beginning of the next phase. But from my perspective, it was very different. As soon as my soul peeled away, I was over the river, and I was greeted by a dozen of, I don't know what to call them, people, spirits, souls. It all sounds a little hokey, but I was greeted by a dozen people who I knew, I had known them for an eternity, and they had known me for an eternity. And they were so happy to see me. It was so joyous. I was so filled with joy at seeing them. And they were not people I could identify, meaning, gee, there's my grandfather and there's my old babysitter. But I knew that had known them for an eternity. And they had known and loved me for an eternity. And we were all, I mean, happy doesn't sound quite right. It was incredibly joyful. And I could see, you know, everyone going crazy down in the river and trying to get my boat. And I could see all that, but, oh, it was really good. And so they started taking me down this path. And at this point, I'm sure everyone you've heard speak will tell you that time and space have a very different reality once you leave. And we could simultaneously be traveling down this path and looking back at the riverbank. And they were taking me down this path, and I knew that not only were they there to greet me and love me, but they were there to protect me as we went on this journey. And I can't tell you from what. I don't know what they were protecting me from, but I know that they were there partly as protectors. And so we were going down this path, and I was so happy. They were beings that were so pure and so radiant and so filled with an absolute and pure love that I never, ever would have left. But I would look back at the riverbank, and this, I mean, they're very dear friends of ours, and this 18-year-old was so sad. I mean, I had so much compassion for him. He just looked so sad. And so I would stop and turn to my guides and say, excuse me just a minute, I'll be right back. And so I would go back and very consciously sort of sit down on my body and lie down, and I would take a breath and then leave. You know, it was his problem. He didn't ask for the right thing. I was trying to do what he asked me. He was asking for me to come and take a breath. And I did. And then I would rejoin these people, and we'd go a little bit further. And then I'd look back, oh, come on. And so I'd say, excuse me just a minute, and I'd go back. And this cycle went on and on. And anyone who has or has had little kids will know exactly what I'm talking about when I say that it was just like when your little kid you're really tired and you want to go to bed, and the kid needs to go to bed, but they want a glass of water, and they want a story, and they want this and that. And finally you're just going, just go to bed. And that's sort of how I felt. I felt like saying, look, I don't want to come back. I'm going home.
Wow.
I'm going to my real home. Don't you get it?
Wow.
Please leave me alone. Stop calling to me. And as we went down this path, we were going to the most radiantly beautiful place that I would say that you can imagine, but you can't imagine. We don't really have the capacity, and we certainly don't have the language or the understanding to even, I don't have the language to tell you what this experience actually was like. But for me, and I will say that each person's experience is really pretty consistent in terms of the descriptions of love and beauty, but the description of beauty is different. And what's beautiful to me is different from what's beautiful to someone else. For me, it was this giant sort of a dome. I mean, I don't even know what the Superdome looks like. I've never seen it, but I think it's sort of like the Superdome, but even bigger. It was this dome-like structure that emitted absolute beauty at a very core level. All the colors simultaneously, but not mixed together to make brown. You know, it's just so tangible. It was as though I could see the beauty and feel it and taste it and touch it. I mean, everything. It was incredible. And pervasive through everything was this absolute sense of love, of an eternal love, of a pure love, beyond what we call unconditional love, but not unconditional without ever having been a question. So we're going to this place, and I knew that this was essentially the entrance to heaven, or the entrance to God's world, and it was clear that it would be inside this area where all people come and have the final choice of choosing to turn toward God or turn away. And I certainly didn't understand then, and I really don't understand now why someone would get to that point and turn away. But it was clear that some people do, and I don't know why. But I was ready, I was excited, I could hardly wait to make that choice to choose God. And as we came closer and closer, I was almost ready to explode with joy because I was home. And I've been asked, well, gosh, while all this was happening, weren't you thinking about your husband and kids? And one of the reasons I really didn't write about my experiences or start talking about them for 10 years is because the fact is, no, I didn't. And I never wanted my kids to think that, I didn't want them to think that they weren't enough, that I really would choose not to come back. But the reality is that I had been reassured by God that they would be fine. What more reassurance can I have? And with that reassurance, no, I didn't think about them anymore. Not that I remember. I mean, I'd like to think maybe I did, but I don't think I did. I wanted to go home. And we came to the entrance, and it's not an entrance like this. I mean, everything's huge. It's, you know, biggie sized. And I could see hundreds or thousands, I don't know, of, again, spirits, souls, whatever you want to call them, sort of moving around, all very busy. And I'm not sure what they were busy doing, but I knew that they were all about God's work. And when I came to the entrance with these people who had brought me, everyone turned and again were so filled with joy. It was like, oh, hooray, she's here. And it was incredible. It's this absolute celebration of not only my spirit being there, but it was also obvious that it was the same celebration for every spirit that showed up. And everyone was filled with joy, and I could hardly wait. And I was all ready to go. And then, with the same intensity of the joy, there was this pervasive sense of disappointment, of not sadness exactly, but recognition that actually I wasn't coming. And that's when the people who had guided me there turned to me and said that it wasn't my time, that I had to go back to Earth. And yes.
She's raising her hand for me.
Oh.
Thank you. I was so enthralled with your description of what I assume is heaven, but I never heard anything about, was there anything of what you would consider earthly beauty? Grass, trees, flowers? Well, you talked about colors and souls. Is there anything else that you could?
Not during that part. And it's almost, there were other things around, but I will tell you that my focus was so much on this particular place, I never took my eyes off of it. So I was sort of aware that there were other things. I don't know what they were. I just wanted to go to this place. So the real answer is I don't know. Yes.
How were they communicating with you? Was it kind of telepathy or was it a language?
It was, well, telepathy to me always seems a little corny.
Well, you know, wordless.
But it was wordless. It was an absolute communication. And for me, it explained, for example, how in biblical stories, God's able to communicate to people in their own language. And this is really the same sort of thing. And it was not communicating like we are, for sure. Yes?
Were you still Mary, or did you have some other identity?
No, I was still, I mean, I never thought about it, but I think I was me. I've been asked, it's kind of a funny thing because I've also been asked what my own body was like. I will tell you that the people who were guiding me were so radiant that I'm not, I wouldn't describe them as humans like people like us wearing clothes. I didn't see them like that. I mean, it was almost like I was seeing them in sort of the general outline of a person, but bursting, exploding with this radiant love. I mean, it's almost like you couldn't see anything else beyond that. And when it came to me personally, I would go back to what I said with the other thing. I'm not actually sure, because I literally was so enthralled with where I was going. It never crossed my mind to look at me and say, what do I look, what's my deal? I mean, when I went back to my body, I sort of feel like I still had sort of a human form, because I did, I mean, I actually sort of sat down in my body and laid back, so I physically felt like I was actually the same sensation of a person doing that. don't know. I never thought to look. Some people have described their bodies, but I just sort of wasn't part of my thinking. And I would look back at my body on the riverbank, and really, I mean, I certainly recognized it, and I knew everything that was happening. And I looked at it as sort of like an old friend, or an old shirt that you have hanging in the closet that you really liked, and it was comfortable and served you well, but it was over. Yes?
Did you have any physical discomfort during the resuscitation?
None. I wasn't there.
So how about after they were done?
Well, I'll get to that. So when they told me I had to go back to Earth, I wasn't happy about it and had no intention of returning. And sort of, I guess my mother would say I'm a little stubborn. And I had no intention of returning, so I protested. And at that point in time was given a few of the reasons why I needed to come back. And wasn't particularly given a choice in the matter. Some people, I think, are given choices. I certainly wasn't. I was said, this is what you're going to do, and here we go. And so we then went back to the riverbank, and I sort of bade goodbye to these people and laid down, and then I was back in my body. And I wasn't there for the resuscitation, so I have no idea. Once I was back in my body, then I was awake and conscious. And at that point, my legs were a mess. I had multiple broken bones in both legs, and the ligaments were all ripped out, and I didn't have any pain. I felt great. Other than being in shock that I was back, I felt great. And at that point in time, they sort of came to the next problem, which is, as I described, how do you get out of there? And even once they got out of there, what happens then? This is in the middle of nowhere. And they looked up, and there were couple of Chilean guys just standing there. And they never said anything, and nothing was ever said to them. But once I was awake and they looked up, the two Chilean guys came, and they loaded me on top of a kayak to sort of serve as a way to carry me. And one of the Chilean guys started hacking away a path in the bamboo. And it was sort of, go up 1 foot, slide back 2. And it was terrible. And I didn't have any pain, but I was very conscious of everything. And I knew I couldn't move my legs. And I'm a spine surgeon. I thought, oh my gosh, I broke my back. And I thought I was paralyzed. And I thought, oh, you've got to be kidding. And so I would sort of keep telling these guys that they needed to give me some steroids. Because steroids help in terms of acute paralysis. So I'd keep yelling at them to give me steroids, and then they'd say, oh, be quiet. So this went on for a long time, and finally they came to a little dirt path, and so they followed the path, not knowing where it was going to go, but thinking that perhaps it would come to a dirt road, and once they came to the dirt road, perhaps they would run down the road and find a tractor or something that they could then use to take me somewhere. They didn't really know where. And so they followed the little path, and they came to the dirt road, and right there was an ambulance waiting for us. And in this country, you say, oh, okay, an ambulance, that's not so strange. But at that time in Chile, there were a couple of ambulances, or a few ambulances in Santiago, but this part of Chile had never seen an ambulance. This was very remote. And I've been asked, well, what was that? And I absolutely think that that ambulance was sent there for me specifically. And the ambulance never was seen after that, nor were the guys that helped carry me out. They just sort of disappeared, and no one had any idea who they were or where they came from or where they went. So the ambulance showed up, and that's when my husband arrived. And we then drove for a couple hours, found a little medical outpost, and my husband put on a couple of splints, long leg splints. And we thought, well, okay, now what? And I made the decision that I was going home for care. I was going back to Wyoming. And I really, to this day, can't quite figure out, number one, why I knew that was the right decision, nor why my husband went along with it. Because anyone in their right mind would call Medivac or would do all sorts of things. And I've certainly had many patients be Medivac from different parts of the world. But we didn't do that. We thought, well, we have our plane tickets for tomorrow. We're supposed to be So we went to the nearest small airport, thinking that we'd fly to Santiago, and I don't know what we were going to do. But that airport was closed for the night. And so we drove to another little airport, and that was closed, but they had an early flight. So we went to a little hotel room or motel room, and my husband carried me on his back, and we went up to the room and spent the night. And I still felt great. I didn't have pain for a couple of weeks. I had no pain. I felt great. And yes,
You were talking at one point about something that happened with one of the women that were further along on a kayak down the river, and they saw a light,
yes.
and you never really finished off what exactly happened to them, or why they thought it was God or any of that.
Well, there's not a lot to that story. It's just that I think that when I was being held and comforted, I mean, I was being enveloped by God. And I think that was, they didn't know what was happening until later.
So they just went down the river, they just saw the light, and then they just kept on going down the river?
No, they were at the bottom of the drop. They weren't downriver. They were sort of waiting. I mean, after you run a big waterfall or a big rapid, whatever, you know, you don't keep going. If you're a group of 6 people, you have safety boaters at the top, you have safety boaters at the bottom, and then people run it. And then once everyone is down and everyone's good, then you all move on as a group. No, this person was part of our group. She was down below waiting.
Oh, waiting for you now.
Yeah.
So was she also ended up being part of the rescue as well?
Oh, yes.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, she was actually the wife of one of the boys.
Okay.
Yeah. So let's see, then,
Did you have all your bones set in Chile?
oh no,
You came back to the States and back to Wyoming.
yeah,
What was the time interval?
I'm getting there. So we spent the night in the motel, or, you know, a low place, and the next morning, went to this little airport, and my husband carried me, as I said, on his back. And so we took this little flight to Santiago, and then we got on our commercial flight to Dallas. And again, this is the part where, yes, you think I'm nuts, and yes, I think I was nuts. I mean, I don't know, but I believed that I was coming back to Wyoming, and I believed it would be fine, and I believed it was God's will. And so that's what I was going to do. So we got on the commercial flight, and, you know, they were a little skeptical. You know, I can't walk, but I don't know what my husband told them, but anyway, it was good. And it was a reasonably empty flight, so we were able to have a whole row of seats, and so that was good. And then when we arrived in Dallas, they had a wheelchair, so I was able to do that. And again, you might say, well, why didn't you stop in Dallas? Dallas has great facilities. I know physicians in Dallas. I don't know, but I didn't. So we got on the next flight, and before that flight, we took one of my splints off because we decided that if I only had one splint on, then maybe it didn't look so bad, and they wouldn't worry so much about it. So we, again, at this time we had a wheelchair. We went down the aisle, and then my husband kind of had to lift me up into the seats. It was pretty clear that it wasn't quite right. And the flight attendants were not impressed with my abilities. And they were not happy that I was on the flight. And when we gave them a song and dance about something, I don't remember, she went and got the pilot. And the pilot came back and asked what the problem was, and we told them that I sprained my ankle and I was late, and, you know, we thought it'd be more comfortable to put a splint on. It wasn't really a big deal. And, I mean, we just outright lied. And he suggested that if the plane crashed, maybe I'd slow people down. And, you know, I really thought, buddy, this is not going to crash. Trust me on this. But we just smiled, we went back to the cockpit, and we then flew to Salt Lake City. Wyoming, where we live, Jackson Hole is about 4.5 hours, 5 hours from Salt Lake. And we had driven there, which, I mean, is a pretty common thing for people who live where we are. So we arrived in Salt Lake City Airport, and by this point, I really couldn't breathe very well. I was having a little trouble. This is now, to answer your question, this is now almost 2 days later. Well, it was 2 days later. And I couldn't really breathe, and I knew things probably weren't so good. So in the airport, we called my internist and suggested that maybe he could meet us at my office and we could take a chest x-ray. Because, you know, I just had this little problem. And so we didn't really get on a plane in Salt Lake City to fly home either, or call, you know, friends of ours. We got in the pickup truck to drive home. I deserved every rolled eye. There's no doubt. And if a patient told me they did this, I would immediately, exactly. It is not something I would recommend, but I absolutely believe that this was the right thing to do. So we got in the pickup truck and we started driving home, and I started getting worse and worse and worse, and I couldn't breathe. And between Salt Lake City and Jackson Hole is in the mountains. We have to go over 2 mountain passes. And we went over the first pass, and I was definitely dying. I couldn't breathe. And I felt like I blew it. I felt like I got it wrong. I had thought that I was coming home, and I blew it. I felt very, very sad. Here I'd been reassured that everything would be fine, and I was very sad for my husband and my kids, and I apologized to him. I said, I'm sorry, I blew it. And then after that, I wasn't talking anymore, and my husband, who is a law-abiding, straight-laced person who, in his lifetime, up until that day, had never gone over the speed limit by even half of a mile, which is why I always drove. He drove as fast as he could. He was terrified. And we came over Teton Pass, which goes up to a little over 10,000 feet, and he knew that that was it. And so then we came down the pass, and I was still sort of breathing, but not particularly conscious, a little bit. And he called the internist and said, okay, not the office, meet us at the emergency room. And we got to the emergency room, and the guys came out, opened the door, and as soon as I saw my internist and then one of the emergency room guys, that was it. I lost consciousness, and that was it for me at that point in time. They pulled me into the emergency room, and not only did I have my legs a mess, my husband and I actually weren't quite as bad as it sounds. When we were in Salt Lake City, we had thought that I probably had a pulmonary embolus because I broke my legs, you know, the whole risk factor, and I was still alive, so, you know, perhaps, you know, it wasn't so bad. But as it really turned out, because it took 2+ days to come home, I had this horrible acute respiratory distress syndrome. And with ARDS, your lungs basically can't transfer the oxygen. They're sort of, it's almost like you take a sponge and fill it up with water. You can't really, the pores don't really work anymore. So when I went to the emergency room and they started looking at everything, and my oxygen level was really, really, really low. And I had this horrible ARDS. The internist basically walked out and told my husband that, you know, that was that. I wasn't going to make it. And if I was still there by morning, that would be a surprise. And suggested that if, you know, he should think about whether he wanted to bring my kids in or not. And as it happens, you know, another coincidence, haha. A woman from our church had cut her finger and was in the emergency room. And the person who had brought her into the emergency room was the nurse for my internist. And when he came out from my room, she saw his face and she just said, this is not going to happen. And she not only started praying, but she went to the high school basketball game. And, you know, when you live in a small town, I mean, everyone is everywhere. So she went to the basketball game, and there were, I don't know, a couple hundred people from our church. And I would say that within an hour, I don't know, hundreds of people were praying intensely and praying very specifically. And she stayed up until about 4 in the morning, praying very specifically. And I will say that I was never a big one for praying for others. I certainly believed in prayer for oneself, meaning, you know, I sort of subscribe to the idea that when you pray, you don't necessarily change the outcome, but you change yourself in the process. But she was praying very specifically for me. And at 4 in the morning, she was done. She said, okay, I'm good. And when I looked back at the medical records, about 4 in the morning is when actually everything shifted. And I stabilized. And it was clear at that point in time from the nursing notes that, wow, she's gonna be alive in the morning. That's really a great thing. And so morning came and I was alive, and that was great. And then I was in the ICU, and it's 4:45, so I'm gonna speed up a little bit. So I was in the ICU, and the next day I still felt great. I didn't have any pain. And I thought, well, okay, here I am, what's next? And I thought, well, I'll read. Some deacons from our church brought in all the magazines that I love. I thought, oh, okay, well, give me those things. Couldn't read them. Everything was absolutely blurry. And I couldn't watch TV. I couldn't have a conversation. I couldn't look at someone for more than about 20 seconds because the blurriness was very irritating. I couldn't do anything. I had to just, if I was in a conversation, I'd be doing this the whole time because I couldn't look at any one thing for more than about 20 seconds. And so I thought, oh gosh, okay. And later in the day, I asked the nurses if they had a Gideon's Bible because those things are everywhere. And I always wondered who put them there and why they're there, but now I know. And they gave me a Gideon's Bible, and I thought, well, okay, I'll look up some of the typical passages, and I couldn't read it. It was all blurry. And I thought, oh gosh, this is going to be a long process if I can't read anything, if I can't see anything. And just as I was putting it down, a verse became crystal clear. And one verse, be joyful always. I thought, oh, okay. I mean, I thought I was a pretty happy person, joyful person. So then I went back to some of the verses I was looking for. It was all blurry, all blurry. And I went back to that one, and it was crystal clear. And I thought, well, okay. I mean, I'm a slow learner, but I get it. And so I read that, and I contemplated that and meditated on that. And later in the day, and over the course of the day, the next verse became clear, which is pray without ceasing. And finally, give thanks in all circumstances, for this is God's will for you. And those 3 sentences were all I could read for days. So I spent a lot of time reading those 3 sentences and thinking about those 3 sentences. And while I was in the ICU, as I was contemplating that, I was then, once again, out of my body. And it was a different experience. It wasn't, my soul peeling away. But I was out of my body, and I was back in, I don't know, part of heaven. I don't know, it was this gloriously beautiful field with wildflowers and, again, color and the most intense, radiant love. And I was in conversation with an angel who really I spent many years, I think it was Christ, and I spent many years not really willing to acknowledge that I think it probably was Jesus, because I really didn't feel like, why would Jesus be talking to me? But it's clear that our minds are so limited by the possibilities. But we had a long conversation, and we had a long conversation about some of the big questions. What's the deal? Why are we here? Why do bad things happen to good people, and all those sorts of things? And then I was back in my room again, and I thought, wow, that was really amazing. I want to know what medication I'm on. Because I was thinking, I can't remember who over here was saying they tried for 30 years to get back there. I was going, I want some of that drug. And so I called the nurses in, and I wanted to find out what medications I was on. And I was told then, and then I subsequently went back and looked at my medical records, and I wasn't on anything. I was getting antibiotics, and that was it. I wasn't in pain, and I wasn't getting any pain medication. I had thought that perhaps they were giving me narcotics, and I didn't really know it. But I wasn't on anything. And so I thought, well, okay. I mean, that was real. And it certainly felt real. And one of the things that I appreciated then, and I've certainly appreciated over the years as I've talked to many people who have had godly experiences, is that, and I've been asked many times, well, gee, was this a dream or a vision or a chemical reaction of a dying brain? And my answer is an absolute no. And one of the reasons is because the memory and the experience of mine, and then I was out of my body one more time, but when God is involved in an experience, it is a different kind of memory. And everyone who's had an experience in this room will know exactly what I'm talking about. When God is involved, the memory is as accurate and as clear as it's happening right now as it was when it happened. I've talked to people who have had experiences 60 plus years in the past, and they relay it exactly as though it were happening real time. The details don't change, the experience doesn't change. I mean, I can remember big events in my life, my wedding, my child's birth, my son's death. But if I'm going to tell that story over the next number of years, I'm quite sure that some of the little details will change. The overall picture won't, but the little details. Yes?
Well, what were the answers to those questions then?
Okay. Well, number one, with regard to why we're here, is very clear. We are here, and this is an opportunity for us. It's not that we're just randomly tossed here. Before we come to Earth, we basically have a pre-life planning session. And we come here for very specific reasons. And those are typically things that lead us to become more Christ-like, whether it's developing tolerance, patience, love. And sometimes we're not here for ourselves. Sometimes we're here to teach someone else compassion or help them somehow in their journey. And sometimes it's both. But we come here with a basic plan. It's not predestiny like some denominations teach, that every minute of your life is planned. There is free will. And there are kind of branch points, and you get to a branch point, and it's free will that takes you one direction or another. But it's really a great opportunity that we have to come. And we need to be about that business. You know, one of the things is that our time here is very short in the big picture. And we need to use every single minute of every day trying to figure out what those purposes are and trying to be about God's business. And every decision we make, every choice we make really matters, because this isn't it. This is a very temporary little bit of what we are. The other question in terms of bad and good, I would tell you there's no such thing. Because when you think about bad and good, it's all a matter of perspective. I've never, ever had someone come up to me and say, wow, you know, that is so great that you were in that boating accident. Never, not a single person. No matter how spiritual they are, no matter what their beliefs are. But I have had hundreds of people tell me, oh my gosh, that must be terrible. It's the greatest gift I was ever given. I would never trade it. And that's true of most people who go through something bad. If you think about it, I mean, the greatest example is looking at Jesus, who I believe was actually here. I think it's historical. The guy was betrayed. He was arrested. He was beaten, humiliated, and killed. That's bad. By all accounts, we should look at that as a horrible tragedy. But the reality is, we celebrate it. We just celebrated it. And we celebrate it because of the effect it had on the last 2,000 years. And I would say that's true of everything that we look at as bad. We may not see the good. I mean, I like to use this analogy of this, you know, God has this huge, unbelievably beautiful, intricately woven tapestry. And we're each a little bitty thread. And it's hard for us to realize how important each one of our lives are. You go to China and the crush of humanity is just overwhelming. And you think, oh my gosh, I'm nothing. I'm a grain of sand. But even that grain of sand on a beach is important. And every little bitty thread in a tapestry is important. And we can't see the big picture. We can only look at ourselves and say, oh, I'm a pink thread. We don't see what that thread is actually creating. And I would say that every, quote, bad event is part of this tapestry. I mean, I've suffered. And there are a number of people in here who have suffered loss. And losing a son is, a son that I love very dearly, is beyond what any person should have to suffer. But I give thanks for it. I knew he was going to die before he died. And I am grateful for it. I give thanks for it. And when you go back to the verses that I had to read for many days, be joyful always. And I think I and each one of us can be joyful always, even in dire circumstances, by developing that trust. And I would say that throughout the experiences I've talked about and subsequently, I often say that I lost my faith. And I did. It was replaced by trust, but I lost my faith. And what I mean when I say that is that when you're a little kid, you have hope. Your parents or someone or somehow you are exposed to God and you hope that God does what he says he's going to do. And then as you are older and you look around and you hear about other people's experiences, you develop faith. And you have faith that, well, yeah, God really does seem to do what he says he's going to do, and okay, I'm good with that. And generally that's where people stop. And they have faith, and faith is not a bad thing. But what you really hope to do is take that faith and not only just look at other experiences. Hopefully you can take something away from my experiences, but what I really hope you take away from it is the inspiration to look at your own life, and whether it's really looking at your own life, or actually it's more helpful to take paper and for 6 months actually write down all the weird things or coincidences that happen, or write down everything and then look back. Humans can generally only see things retrospectively. You look back at that journal and you go, oh my gosh, wow, God's actually working in my life. I just didn't realize it. And going through there and seeing that God is actually not something for someone else, and not something that was done, 1,000 years ago, but wow, I see miracles happening in my life. I see God's presence in my life. Then all of a sudden that faith transforms into a trust. And it's really an absolute trust that allows me, and an absolute trust, I think, that allows everyone to face dire circumstances with a joyful heart. Because I trust absolutely that God has this beautiful tapestry. And no matter what's happening, I may not like what's happening, and yes, I'm still sad that my son is not physically here, because we had a good time. I love the guy. But that's different from being stuck in grief and despair. I don't have despair because I know, first of all, he didn't suffer when he died. He was hit by a car. I know that God sent his most gentle, joyous angels to greet him. I know that he didn't want to come back. And I know that it was part of his plan. And I've seen already many of the positive ripple effects. And there are many, many more that I'll never see. But it's really that trust, I think, that is the most profound change for me in terms of going through a number of these experiences.
You said you knew he was gonna die before he did. When was that revealed to you?
When he was 4 or 5, this is a really nutshell version. When he was 4 or 5, he told me that he wasn't gonna live to be 18. And then when I had my boating accident, first when I was rejected from heaven, and then subsequently in an out-of-body conversation with Jesus, I was told that one of the reasons I had to be here was to be here for my son's death, so that I could really be that absolute spiritual rock that others could cling to as they reached out for God, and really help. It's a long story. My son was very loved in our community and actually did have a big impact nationally. And it was hugely traumatic for not just me and my family, but for a bigger community. And I was able to, again, because of these experiences and because I knew it was going to happen, I was able to help others instead of being mired in, gee, this isn't fair and why this happened and everything else. I was really able to help direct them to God. So, anyway, that's it.